My name is Emily Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of Southeast Kentucky African American Museum and Cultural Center. And we are excited about today. Today is the official day that we unveil our quilt that we created during our workshop, Stories Behind the Quilt workshop a few months ago. It all started when we realized that quilting in the African American community is going by the wayside. It's not being passed down. And we wanted to increase this interest in quilting. And as we met in this series of workshops, the history that came forth was just so important. The history that came forth, the stories that came forth, and so we are excited to show you this quilt that came out of these workshops. Each participant in the workshop shared what was important to them as their contribution to the quilt. For example, mountains are important to me. I love the mountains of Southeast Kentucky. And so we were able to weave mountains into this quilt. Sister Becky will come along in a minute and tell what was important to her. And then after that, we're going to let Sandra Jones come and tell us about the story behind this quilt. She did a lot of the grunt work in putting it together. She took the vision and ran with it. And so we'll let her come in a little bit and tell you the story behind the quilt.
My name is Rebecca Kornett, and I'm also on the board of the Southeastern Kentucky African American Museum and Cultural Center. I came down to the story behind the quilt. And my vision for the quilt was I live on Town Mountain, and we have the most beautiful sunset that people really pay to see. So I said the sunset. Well, Sister Kay Jones says, you know, her vision is much broader than I could have imagined, which is beautiful. The sunrise. So that was my vision, and just sitting and being inspired by the stories behind the quilt. I never envisioned when I would see my elders quilting that there was a story behind it. We're thinking that as children, they're in there sewing. You know, as children, you couldn't sit around. You had to play outside. But then to hear the different stories behind the quilt. So it's interesting, it's beautiful, it's inspiring, educational. You learn so much. I have learned so much just behind the stories behind the quilt. So I'm just looking forward to see where this journey is going to take us, and it's an everlasting journey. As Pastor Emily Hudson said, it's dying out. Our children does not know anything about quilting or a story behind the quilt. So I thank God that we are now introducing again, the stories behind the quilt.
So my name is Sandra Jones, and I am going to tell you the story behind this quilt. I became a part of this story behind the quilt workshop, and little did I know that I would be doing this project. I didn't think I would get a vision for it, and as we sat around the table and talked about what was important to us, it just started coming together. Emily's was the mountains. Rebecca's was the sunset, and mine was the ocean. We had recently come back from vacation. We had gone to the beach, and that was in my spirit. So that all kind of come together, and we started with this center panel, which is authentic African fabric, and I titled this quilt. You've heard the saying, from the cradle to the grave. This is from the cradle to resurrection, to the resurrection. We're starting in the cradle of civilization, Africa, where Africans were and still are hardworking people, intelligent people. They knew how to, they had a means to a way of getting things done to provide for their needs. But one day, slavery entered into the picture, and they were put on the slave ships, brought across the ocean. Many got sick and were tossed overboard. So this symbolizes the watery grave. And you see there are silhouettes, heads of Africans bobbing in the water. They are drowning. You can't see their faces because the slave traders did not see them as people. They did not see them as people who have souls. They did not see them as people who had families, people who had communities, who were running their communities and taking care of each other. They only saw them as a way, a means to meet their ends, to satisfy their own purposes and goals in life. So you don't see their eyes and you don't see their mouths or their noses, because to them they were nobody. So that's what it is on the bottom, a watery grave. But now many Africans, once they became African Americans, ended up here in the Appalachian Mountains as slaves, and that's where you see the mountains here that represent the Appalachian Mountains along the journey. We were here, and then you see the sunrise up here, which is actually a representation of the SON and not the SUN, as he resurrects us on our journey from our trials and our tribulations, and from the effects of slavery. We are now a freed people, and still intelligent, still hardworking, still able to make a way to meet our ends. But God has a purpose and a plan for each and every one of us. And as it just so happens that when I was piecing the sunrise together, I wanted to make it even on each side and make each side equivalent to the other. So I counted the rays when I got to the middle, and this is a total of 39 rays, which is symbolic of the stripes that Jesus bore for us before he was crucified on the cross. I didn't plan it that way. It just worked out that way. And you see the quilting here, the stitching, which the quilter really caught my vision on this. Down here, you have the waves in the water. And here you have, they're stitching here that goes along with these authentic African blocks here. And then there's these rays, these golden rays. It looks like the heat coming off of the sunrise. So it was a very intense project. The sunrise was the most tedious part and the most enduring part of it. And when I finished the sunrise, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. but it was there was a pleasure, a peace in doing this quilt, even though I was, I had to get back in here. I found myself having to get back in here, make time to get back in here to finish this quilt. And if you guys want to flip it for me, and we can show the back, change sides there. This center block here is also authentic African fabric, and so it correlates with some of the blocks on the front of the quilt, and we just kind of correlated blended some fabrics in here to make it look earthy, and it almost looks velvety, but so we wanted to make the back just as pretty as the front. So that's the story behind this quilt. I hope you enjoyed listening to it, and it would be good to get some feedback from you whenever you take a look at it.